Never say these 13 things to a Sagittarius. There are some things you should never say to a Sagittarius, not because they are easily offended, but because their soul was born to wander freely, love boldly, and believe fiercely in truth. One wrong phrase, even said in passing, can pierce a place inside them that most people never even try to understand. And when that happens, you don't just lose their smile or their words. You lose the entire universe of light they were willing to share with you. You see, Sagittarius is not just a zodiac sign. It is the fire of belief, the arrow of raw honesty, and the sacred quest for deeper meaning. They do not ask for perfection, but they do expect sincerity. And when they sense that the space between you is no longer safe for truth, they don't argue. They vanish. No resentment. No drama. Just a quiet departure that feels like a door closing between you and something you didn't even know you were blessed to witness. In this video, we'll explore the 13 phrases you should never say to a Sagittarius, because each one doesn't just miss the mark, it wounds the soul of a seeker who only ever wanted to trust you. If you've ever loved a Sagittarius, or if you are one, this is for you. Please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe if your heart feels seen here. Let's walk this path of wisdom together. Gate 1: the pain behind the words. Why these simple phrases cut so deep for Sagittarius? For Sagittarius, freedom is not a concept. It's the breath that keeps the soul alive. This sign was born with a compass inside the chest, forever pointing toward truth, adventure, expansion. But what many forget is that Sagittarius is not just the wild traveler, the playful philosopher, the eternal student of life. They are also the soul that carries silent wounds, masked by a laugh, hidden behind a dream of distant lands. And one of the deepest wounds they carry is being misunderstood at their core. When you say the wrong words to a Sagittarius, especially the ones that clip their wings or shame their fire, you're not just making a passing comment. You are cracking the very structure of their inner world. In this gate, we'll explore the first phrases that often wound Sagittarius more than people realize. Not because they are weak, but because these phrases betray the sacred parts of them that they rarely let others see. You're too much. That simple sentence, often said with a smile or in jest, has probably haunted more Sagittarians than they care to admit. Too loud, too bold, too honest, too impulsive, too optimistic, too dreamy, too intense. But what the world calls too much is exactly what makes Sagittarius magical. They weren't born to be contained. They were born to expand the edges of existence, to open minds, to shake the dust off stagnation and make life feel alive again. I once knew a Sagittarius woman who lit up every room she entered. People laughed louder when she spoke. They leaned in when she told stories. And yet, time after time, she heard those words from partners, friends, even family. You're just too much sometimes. Eventually, she stopped shining. She smiled less. She became smaller, not because she lost her fire, but because no one knew how to hold it gently. What's the lesson here? Never try to shrink the soul of someone who was born to expand. Because once Sagittarius begins to dim their light, the whole world becomes a little less bright. Just settle down already. That phrase may seem innocent, even loving, but to Sagittarius, it feels like a prison sentence wrapped in good intentions. Settling down for this sign is not about fear of commitment. It's about fear of losing themselves in someone else's version of what life should be. In astrology, Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, the planet of expansion, of faith, of the boundless sky. They're not afraid of love, they crave it. But they want a love that breathes, that moves, that grows with them. When someone demands that they settle, what Sagittarius hears is, I want you to stop exploring, stop wondering, stop evolving. I once met a Sagittarius man who loved a woman deeply. So deeply, in fact, that he was ready to build a life with her. But every time he talked about a new idea or a dream to travel, she would sigh and say, when are you going to stop chasing fantasy and just settle down like everyone else? He tried. He really did. He stayed. He bought the house. He did everything right. But he grew more restless with every passing year. Until one day, he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. He didn't leave because he stopped loving her. He left because he realized he had stopped loving himself. The truth? Sagittarius doesn't need to be anchored. They need to be trusted to fly and still return home. You're always running away. This sentence cuts deeper than most, because it implies cowardice. as if Sagittarius flees instead of facing. But the truth is, when Sagittarius leaves, it's often not because they're afraid. It's because they've already tried, already stayed, already waited too long. They are hopeful creatures, sometimes to a fault, but once they see that a situation is robbing them of their soul fire, they leave not to escape, but to preserve what's left of their spirit. I remember a Sagittarius girl, just 22, who loved a man who belittled her dreams. She kept hoping he'd change, that he'd understand, that he'd see her vision. But every time she opened her mouth to share a piece of her future, he'd roll his eyes and call her unrealistic. One night, she packed everything she owned into a car and drove across the country. He never got a goodbye. Later, she said to me, "I didn't run away. I ran toward the life I was meant to live." That's the Sagittarius way. They don't flee to escape, they move to expand. Don't judge the soul who leaves when it's the only way to breathe again. You should be more realistic. Realism in many people's eyes is a virtue, but to Sagittarius it often feels like a cage. This is the sign of vision, of belief, of possibilities not yet born. They live in the wide open space between what is and what could be. And when someone tells them to be realistic, what they often mean is, conform, fit in, don't dream so wildly. But Sagittarius doesn't just dream, they manifest. Not with force but with faith. They believe that just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's impossible. I once coached a Sagittarius writer who had a vision for a novel that publishers kept rejecting. "It's too mystical," they told her. "Too strange. Too idealistic." Friends urged her to write something more practical, but she didn't. She kept writing. 10 years later, that novel became a bestseller, translated into 20 languages. "If I had listened," she told me, "I would have betrayed the only part of me that truly knew the way." That's the Sagittarius lesson. Realism may keep you safe, but faith takes you to places realism has never dared to imagine. You think you know everything. This sentence stings not because it's true, but because it misunderstands the very essence of Sagittarius curiosity. Yes, they have strong opinions. Yes, they speak with conviction. But they're also the first to say, "Tell me more. Teach me. What do you believe?" Their thirst for truth isn't about arrogance. It's about a soul-deep hunger to understand the world, to connect the dots, to find meaning in the madness. When people accuse Sagittarius of being a know-it-all, they're often reacting to the sign's confidence, mistaking their fire for superiority. But what they miss is the childlike awe behind that fire. The wonder, the wide-eyed amazement at life's mysteries. Sagittarius doesn't claim to know it all. They just want to know more than what's on the surface. I once met a Sagittarius teacher who got in trouble for encouraging his students to question the textbook. He didn't do it to rebel. He did it because he believed in truth beyond the page. And isn't that the gift of Sagittarius? To ignite questions where others only accept answers? And perhaps the most subtle phrase of all, the one that seems harmless but can pierce the deepest part of a Sagittarius soul. You take things too personally. Because here's the truth. For Sagittarius, everything is personal. Not because they're oversensitive, but because they live with their heart wide open. Every idea they share is a piece of them. Every dream, every truth, every passion. It all comes from a sacred place within. So when someone mocks it, doubts it, or belittles it, Sagittarius doesn't just shrug it off. They feel it. They question themselves. And slowly they begin to pull back. They become quiet, distant, no longer offering their wisdom or stories as freely. Because they've learned. The world doesn't always know what to do with a soul that feels so alive. And once they retreat, once the flame dims, it's hard to rekindle what's been misunderstood too many times. These phrases may seem small, but to Sagittarius, they carry the weight of years. Not because Sagittarius is fragile, but because they live fully. They feel deeply. They believe, they hope, they fall, they rise. And they carry it all with a grace that few ever see. In Gate 2, we will begin to explore what happens when Sagittarius is wounded by those closest to them. Not by strangers, but by the very people they trusted to believe in their fire. Because betrayal for Sagittarius doesn't begin with actions. It begins when their truth is no longer welcomed. Are you ready to walk deeper with me into that sacred fire? Let's go. Gate 2, the silent wounds of freedom. Why Sagittarius withdraws without warning. There is a sacred fire that burns inside every Sagittarius. A fire that cannot be caged, not because it is wild, but because it carries ancient memory. This fire remembers what it is like to be silenced, to be shaped into something smaller just to be accepted, to be loved conditionally, so long as they shrink their truth into something more manageable for others. And so when a Sagittarius begins to withdraw, when they laugh less and their eyes no longer meet yours with the same sparkle, know that it is not drama. It is not arrogance. It is a soul protecting itself in the only way it knows how, by retreating into silence when it feels its freedom is being mistaken for carelessness. People think Sagittarius disappears because they fear commitment, but the truth is far more tender than that. They disappear when their truth is no longer safe. When the things they say are misunderstood again and again. When their genuine fire is labeled too much, too intense, too opinionated. A Sagittarius doesn't need the world to agree with them. They only need to feel that their honesty won't be punished. But when even that is too much, they quietly begin to pack their soul in silence and leave. Not to hurt, not to prove anything, but because they refuse to stay in a space where they must apologize for being exactly who they are. I once knew a Sagittarius man who had an enormous heart, passionate, opinionated, brave. He loved a woman who always said she admired honesty, until one day, he shared something vulnerable about his past. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even dark. It was simply real. And she laughed nervously and said, "You're being so intense again." He said nothing, but later that night he didn't call. The next day he canceled dinner. The week after, he slowly began to vanish from her life. No arguments, no confrontation, just a vanishing. And when I asked him why, he said, "Because I shared something sacred, and she turned it into something uncomfortable." That's when I knew I couldn't keep my heart there anymore. That is the quiet storm Sagittarius carries, the one that leaves not because they lack love, but because they refuse to let that love suffocate. People often misread Sagittarius silence as indifference, but in truth it is sacred grief. It is the mourning of a place they once hoped would be a home for their truth. When you tell a Sagittarius you're too blunt, you're not just commenting on their words. You are rejecting the part of them that has spent lifetimes learning how to speak from the soul, even when it shakes. And when you laugh off their dreams as unrealistic, or call them naive for believing in big, impossible visions, you are not grounding them. You are breaking the very compass they've always followed to survive. Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, the planet of expansion, meaning, and divine faith. This sign doesn't just chase freedom for fun. It seeks it as oxygen. And when that freedom is dismissed or denied, they do not argue. They do not beg to be heard. They quietly find the nearest door, step into the dark, and walk away. The deepest heartbreaks of Sagittarius never come from enemies. They come from people they once called home, those they allowed into the temple of their beliefs, their values, their dreams. When those sacred things are ridiculed or minimized, Sagittarius learns a hard lesson. Not everyone is meant to walk beside their fire. And yet they still grieve it. Not loudly, not with blame, but with a sacred silence that burns behind their eyes. And in that silence they do what only Sagittarius knows how to do. They turn pain into wisdom. They climb the mountain of their heartbreak, and from the summit they begin again. But the one thing they don't do is return. Because Sagittarius rarely walks the same path twice. When they leave, they do so with love, but also with finality. A woman once told me that her Sagittarius daughter stopped visiting after years of quiet tension. She said, "All I asked was that she stop bringing up those political ideas at dinner." But what she didn't realize was this. Those ideas weren't politics to her daughter. They were beliefs shaped by heartbreak, by experience, by years of spiritual searching. What she asked her to suppress wasn't an opinion. It was her truth. And when that happened too many times, her daughter stopped coming, stopped calling. And the mother said, "I miss her energy so much. I didn't know that was the cost." That's the wound that never gets named. When people silence the flame of Sagittarius, they also lose its warmth. Not because Sagittarius wanted it that way, but because the fire cannot burn in a space that smothers it. Have you ever felt that? That moment when you say something raw and someone tells you, "Don't be so dramatic." Or when you light up about a dream and someone says, "Be realistic." And suddenly you feel like a balloon slowly deflating. Not all at once. just enough to make you doubt the very joy you were about to give. That's the fracture Sagittarius experiences again and again. But instead of arguing, instead of proving their passion, they do something far more powerful. They leave. They take all their laughter, their loyalty, their wanderlust, their contagious belief in the beauty of the unknown, and they walk away. Not because you weren't good enough, but because they were no longer safe to be themselves. And when you love the way Sagittarius does, safety means everything. Not safety from harm. Safety to dream, to speak, to question, to be. In the heart of Sagittarius lies a sacred longing. Not for a perfect love, but for a true one. One where their soul can wander without fear of being judged. Where their questions are not seen as rebellion, but as sacred curiosity. Where their intensity is not mocked but cherished. If you ever want to keep a Sagittarius in your life, don't ask them to be less. Don't soften their voice. Don't redirect their gaze. Just sit with them. Witness them. Let them speak. Let them be silent. Let them burn. Let them bloom. And in return, they will take you places you never dared to dream. Not just in the world, but within yourself. Because Sagittarius is not just a sign of freedom. It is a sign of faith. Faith that truth will set us free. Faith that even after loss, joy returns. Faith that if they keep walking, something meaningful will appear on the horizon. But the one thing they cannot survive is being shamed for the very truth they carry. They don't need constant agreement, but they do need space to be whole. So the next time a Sagittarius goes quiet, before you assume they're being cold or detached, ask yourself, was their truth honored here? Was their spirit seen? Because when Sagittarius disappears, they're not punishing you. They're preserving themselves. And if you are the Sagittarius in this story, if you've ever walked away from a table where your truth was unwelcome, from a relationship that asked you to dim your fire, from a family that confused your honesty for rebellion, let this be your healing declaration. I do not need to be smaller to be loved. My truth is not too much. My fire is sacred. And if they cannot sit in its warmth, I will build a new fire elsewhere, not out of revenge, but out of reverence for the soul I am becoming. Gate 3. The soul connection Sagittarius longs for. And why their love is often too vast to be held. There's a sacred truth that few recognize about Sagittarius. Behind their laughter, behind the freedom-loving spark in their eyes, behind the fire that urges them to explore new lands and touch new ideas, there lives a depth of longing that is rarely spoken. Because for Sagittarius, love isn't just about companionship. It's not about routine or expectations or even security. For them, love is a quest, a spiritual journey toward someone whose soul echoes their own. They seek a connection that speaks in silence, a partnership where minds expand and spirits evolve together. But the world often misunderstands this yearning. The world sees their distance and calls it detachment. It sees their longing for freedom and mistakes it for disloyalty. It doesn't understand that Sagittarius doesn't fear commitment. They fear confinement. They don't run from love. They run from love that tries to cage their wings. There once was a Sagittarius man I met who spent years chasing his dream across continents. He told me about a woman he loved deeply, fiercely, but she always asked, "When will you settle down?" And he always answered, "When I feel like my soul is still moving, I can't stand still." She mistook this as a refusal to love her. But what she didn't see was that every poem he wrote in hotel rooms, every photo he took at sunrise, every song he recorded while missing her, was love in motion. It wasn't absence, it was devotion that needed air. For Sagittarius, love must breathe. And yet, they are often judged for needing space, as if asking for silence means they care less, as if choosing solitude is a rejection. But in truth, when a Sagittarius pulls away, it's often because they feel too much. They are overwhelmed not by boredom, but by the intensity of wanting to be everything they can for someone. In astrology, Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, the planet of growth, truth, and higher learning. Their love is a classroom, a chapel, a distant mountain only they dare climb. And when they let someone into that inner sanctuary, it's because they believe that person is also a seeker. But if that person only wants a safe harbor and not the open sea, Sagittarius begins to shrink. And nothing is more painful for this sign than having to dim their light for the comfort of another. I knew a Sagittarius woman once who gave up her scholarship abroad to stay with the man she thought was her forever. She said, He needed me to prove that love meant staying. She did stay. For a while. But the longer she remained, the quieter her laughter became. The more she loved him the way he needed, the more she forgot how to love herself the way she was born to. Eventually she left. Not because she stopped loving him, but because her soul whispered, "You cannot water someone else's garden while letting your own wither." When Sagittarius walks away, they don't slam doors. They leave with a silence that holds grief and reverence. Because when they say goodbye, they are letting go of not just the person, but the future they had envisioned together. And that's no small wound for them. They dreamed of growing side by side, learning, expanding, laughing beneath stars, waking up in a different country every anniversary. That vision collapses quietly when their partner asks them to stop being so restless, or so intense, or so philosophical. You see, Sagittarius needs their love to be a holy fire, not a comfortable candle. They want to explore your soul, not manage your schedule. They long to know your dreams, your fears, your most wild ambitions. Not whether dinner will be at 7. And yet the world tells them, be more grounded, stop being so intense, stop asking so many questions, stop searching for meaning in everything. But they can't, and they shouldn't, because that's who they are. They are the soul you meet once in a lifetime who inspires you to live more deeply, love more truthfully, and ask the questions you once feared. When their love is dismissed as too much, too intense, too abstract, Sagittarius doesn't argue. They withdraw. Not to punish you, but to protect the sacred fire within. I once met a man who said, "I still remember the way she looked at the stars. It was like they were speaking only to her." He was speaking of his Sagittarius ex. He didn't realize how deeply she loved him until her energy left his world. And he told me, "I tried to find that gaze in someone else, but I couldn't. It was like her eyes saw the part of me I hadn't even accepted yet." That is what Sagittarius offers. A love that believes in who you can become. A love that holds the vision of your soul, not just your current self. But it takes courage to be loved like that, because it means facing the places inside you that still haven't grown. And not everyone is ready for that. Some people are afraid of growth. Some would rather stay in the shallow waters. And that's okay. But Sagittarius cannot remain in the shallow end for long. If they do, they begin to drown. Not in water, but in silence. In the absence of meaning. So what can you do if you love a Sagittarius? Don't cage them. Ask them where they want to go, what they dream about, what scares them at night when the world falls asleep. Let them speak of myths and books and distant cities and the way the moon felt different last night. And if you can't follow them to all the places they long to go, at least believe in them enough to not clip their wings. For if you do, you may wake up one day and realize that the person who once looked at you like you were their entire universe has become a constellation you can no longer reach. And if you are a Sagittarius who has ever felt too much, loved too deeply, dreamed too wildly, and been told you were too intense or unlovable because of it, please write this now as a vow to yourself. I will no longer shrink my fire for anyone who fears its light. I was not born to be contained. I was born to expand. I was born to love with truth, with vision, and with the wild courage of a soul that remembers what freedom really means. And maybe, just maybe, the one who is meant for you will not ask you to stop shining. They will bring their own fire, and together you will build a temple of stars. Gate 4. The awakening that happens when no one is watching. There is a moment in every Sagittarius soul's journey when the search for truth turns inward. Not because the outside world has nothing left to offer, but because the silence inside has grown louder than any voice around them. After the heartbreak, after the long nights where questions had no answers, something happens. Not with fireworks, not with divine intervention descending from the sky, but with a quiet clarity that feels like sunlight on skin after a long winter. This is the gate where the Sagittarius soul awakens. Not to a new world, but to the parts of themselves they forgot they were allowed to love. Sagittarius is known for their fire, for the passion they carry into every adventure and every heartbreak alike. But what the world often forgets is that this fire is sacred. It is not just a force that burns outward. When life becomes too heavy, when love leaves without reason, when the Sagittarius heart is asked to carry more than its share, the fire folds inward. It becomes a lantern inside the ribcage, illuminating all the rooms in their soul that were once locked. And this awakening, this return to inner light, is perhaps the most courageous thing they will ever do. Many people assume that Sagittarius escapes pain by running, by chasing something new, by burying what hurts beneath spontaneity and laughter. But the truth is, when a Sagittarius has been wounded at their core, when they've given their deepest love to someone who only saw the surface, they don't run away, they return. Not to the past, not to the person, but to the place inside themselves where their soul first learned to hope. And it is there, in that sacred inner wilderness, that they begin to rebuild. I once knew a Sagittarius woman whose marriage ended without warning. One day she came home to an empty house and a note that said, "I'm sorry, but I can't love you the way you need." No argument, no closure, just silence. For months she wandered, not physically but emotionally, trying to understand what she did wrong, what she failed to be. People told her to move on, to take a trip, to find someone new. But she didn't want distraction. What she wanted was truth. So she did what few would expect of a Sagittarius. She stopped chasing. She stopped trying to fix what broke. Instead, she sat with the stillness. She returned to her childhood piano. She began journaling again. She walked barefoot in the woods near her home, whispering prayers to the trees, as if asking the earth to remember her when she couldn't remember who she was. That winter something changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but slowly, like fog lifting from a valley. She began to laugh again, not because she had forgotten the pain, but because she had remembered her strength. She told me, "For the first time I didn't feel like I needed to be more or less for anyone. I felt like myself. And that was enough." This is what awakening looks like for Sagittarius. It's not about proving anything. It's about reclaiming everything. In astrology, Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, the planet of expansion, wisdom, and faith. But before expansion can happen, there must be space. And sometimes the universe clears that space in painful ways. The ones who walk away, the doors that close, the love that doesn't stay. None of these are punishments. They are sacred permissions. Permission for the Sagittarius soul to grow inward before it grows outward again. Permission to learn the difference between attachment and love. Permission to understand that their freedom is not selfishness, it is survival. There's a myth that Sagittarius always bounces back quickly. But what most people don't realize is that the Sagittarius bounce back is not surface-level recovery. It is a pilgrimage, a journey through the hidden terrain of their own soul. One that requires honesty, humility, and above all, patience. They don't heal in the light. They heal in the shadow, the place where no one is watching, where the expectations fall away, where the only voice that matters is the one that says, "I still believe in you." Have you ever felt that shift? That gentle moment where the thing that once shattered you no longer defines you? That's not forgetting. That's not pretending it never happened. That is awakening. That is your soul learning to walk barefoot again across the broken glass of memory without bleeding. That is your fire no longer asking for fuel from outside sources, but learning to burn steady from within. If you are a Sagittarius who has loved deeply and lost silently, if you have been told that your passion is too intense or your emotions too wild, know this: you are not too much. You were simply meant to feel everything so you could become a map for others who are still lost in the dark. Your truth, your joy, your heartbreak, it all matters. And when you rise, and you will, you won't need anyone to notice. Because the real gift of awakening is not that the world sees you differently. It's that you no longer need them to. A Sagittarius reborn is a soul who no longer begs to be chosen. They choose themselves. They light their own path. They walk with grace in one hand and fire in the other. They remember who they were before the world told them who they should be. And they return, not as the person who once needed saving, but as the guide who now saves others by simply existing in truth. So if today feels heavy, if you are still in the part of the journey where nothing makes sense, where your light feels dim and your hope distant, just breathe. You are closer than you think. You are not broken. You are being shaped. You are not abandoned. You are being redirected. And soon, very soon, you will wake up and realize that the strength you were searching for has been growing quietly inside you this entire time. That is the Sagittarius awakening. And it happens beautifully when no one is watching. Conclusion: the soul that chose light, even when it hurt. And now, dear Sagittarius, you have walked the long road with me. Through the fire and through the quiet, through the breaking and the becoming, through every sacred gate where your heart was asked not just to survive, but to transform. You have seen the cost of feeling deeply in a world that asks you to be numb. You have tasted betrayal, wandered through grief, carried the weight of love that was never returned in the way your soul deserved. But even still, you did not shut down. You did not stop believing. You did not harden your heart. Instead, you chose light. You chose to feel. You chose to rise. This is the power of a Sagittarius soul. Not because it never breaks, but because it always rebuilds. You carry the fire of Jupiter, yes, but it is a holy fire. Not one that destroys, but one that warms the forgotten places. Your pain has never been your weakness. It has been your teacher, your alchemist, your way home. And now that you are standing on the other side, perhaps with fewer illusions but more truth, you can finally see what all of this was preparing you for. Not just to love others, but to love yourself without condition. Not just to be chosen by someone else, but to choose your own heart, again and again, even when it trembles. There is something miraculous about the way Sagittarius heals. You do not demand applause. You do not seek pity. You simply keep walking. You gather your truth in both hands. You stop needing explanations. And in the silence that once broke you, you find a new voice, your own. So let that voice guide you now. Let it speak softly when others are loud. Let it remind you of who you are when the world forgets. And let it sing your soul awake, even in the darkness. If this journey has stirred something within you, if it made you remember your worth, if even for a moment it gave your soul room to breathe, then let this be our quiet pact, that you will not shrink again, that you will not hide your fire just because it once burned the wrong hands, that you will not doubt your softness, your insight, your hunger for meaning. You were never here to be ordinary. You were born to awaken, to inspire, to expand. And every step of your pain was never the end. It was always the initiation. If this spoke to your spirit, I invite you now to like, share, and subscribe. Not for me, but as a sacred ripple of energy that says, I'm still here. I still believe in the light. Let others who are walking alone find this path, and remember, they are not broken. They are becoming.